In a cold Detroit salvage yard, Weston Hale held up a $20 bill in front of a crowd of wealthy bidders picking through the carcass of a bankrupt American automaker. Bryce Langston laughed out loud, calling what Weston had chosen a dead heap of iron not worth the cost of a tow truck. Celeste Mercer shook her head, certain a broke single dad was buying scrap to tinker with in his small garage on the edge of the city. Weston said nothing back. He pressed his fingertips against a faded stamp on the side of the metal block and spoke quietly to no one in particular. You just walked past the last American roar. Stay until the end, because 1 month later, the sound from that garage was going to make Millionaires go completely still. The morning of the auction had broken gray and cold, the kind of mid-November sky that pressed down over Detroit like a lid, keeping the smoke and the silence close to the ground. Cascade Automotive, a company that had spent 80 years building American engines, had filed for bankruptcy 3 months earlier, and now its remaining inventory was being auctioned off, piece by piece, spread across 3 acres of cracked concrete at an industrial salvage yard where 2 interstates crossed and shuttered. Factory bones still lined the roads like monuments nobody had gotten around to removing. The crowd that gathered was not the usual collection of scrappers and hobbyists, because word had traveled through collector networks and investment circles that Cascade's final assets included prototype components that had never made it into production, and the people who came dressed accordingly, in tailored overcoats and with company tablets, bidding on vintage signage and photographing serial numbers and hunting for anything that might shorten a development timeline. Bryce Langston moved through the crowd the way powerful men always move through rooms they consider beneath them, slowly, letting people notice that his presence made the event more significant. He wore a coat that cost more than most people at the auction earned in a month and spoke loudly to the assistants trailing him, pointing at items and dismissing them before his hand had finished moving. Weston Hale arrived in a white pickup with 240,000 miles on it, and a tailgate that only stayed closed if you remembered to lift it slightly before you pushed it shut. He wore a canvas work jacket with a grease stain on the left cuff he had tried to scrub out the night before, and he walked directly past the well-attended rows of vintage body panels and collectible signage to a far corner where a low pallet held engine components piled under a tarp and labeled in marker as mixed scrap engine parts, condition unknown. Weston crouched beside the pallet and worked through each piece methodically, turning components in his bare hands, wiping grime with the rag from his back pocket, letting them tell him what they were before he decided what to think. Bryce noticed him on one knee in the dirt and said something loud enough to carry, saying that if the man needed parts for his hobby project, the junkyard on Schaefer had better pickings and free coffee on Saturdays. Several people laughed. Celeste Mercer, CEO of Mercervale Motors, glanced over from 2 rows away, took in the scene with one professional look, and returned to her conversation, thinking nothing more of it. When the auctioneer reached the final lot and called for opening bids on the scrap engine parts, Weston raised his hand and said $20. Someone near the refreshment table asked if there had been a bid. The number was repeated. A few people laughed again, the easy laughter of people who do not need to be careful about what they miss. Nobody countered. Weston waited until the paperwork was signed before he allowed himself to look closely at the casting he had carried to his truck. He turned it in the pale November light until he found what he had suspected from 6 feet away. Letters and digits barely legible under grime and light rust, stamped into the metal during manufacturing. H47. Below it, in smaller type, a name the rest of the crowd would not have recognized even standing close enough to read it. Meridian Core. Weston stood very still, his thumb moving over the letters as if reading them twice through his fingertips. Then he loaded the rest of the lot with the careful movements of a man who has found something he is not yet ready to explain. The drive back took 40 minutes through mid-morning traffic, and Weston spent it in silence, thinking through what he had seen and what it meant if he was right. His garage sat at the end of a residential block on the western edge of the city, a two-car standalone structure with faded green siding and a hand-stenciled sign reading Hale Mechanical, General Repair and Restoration. The neighbors had long since stopped paying attention to what arrived through that roller door. Only the retired machinist across the street, a man named Garfield, who sometimes walked over on quiet afternoons to watch Weston work, stood on his porch and called out that it looked like Weston had bought himself a very expensive headache. Weston told him the headache had cost $20, and he expected the cure to take about a month. Inside, the garage told the story of a man who took his work seriously even when nobody else did. Tools hung on pegboard in order of size and purpose, clean and oiled, each with its outline traced in black markers so a missing piece would be obvious at a glance. His workbench ran the full length of the back wall, covered with technical manuals, hand-drawn measurement on graph paper, and at the far left corner, a small framed photograph he never talked about and rarely looked at directly. He cleared the main bench and began unloading the salvage piece by piece, laying everything in the order he intended to examine it, a sequence he had already planned on the drive. What he found over the next 3 hours confirmed what the stamp had suggested. He worked through each component with calipers, a bore gauge, and reference drawings he kept in a flat file beneath the bench. Drawings made from memory years ago when he had first understood that the project they were canceling was worth preserving. The tolerances on the machined surfaces matched. The port configuration matched. The casting geometry matched dimensions no manufacturer would reproduce unless building exactly what this was. Weston set down his tools and stood with his hands flat on the bench, understanding precisely what he had in front of him and what it would take to make it whole. He called Holden Barrett, an attorney he had known since college, who specialized in commercial property and intellectual rights. He explained the auction, the purchase, and the lot number, and asked whether a public auction with a signed receipt created unambiguous ownership. Holden said yes, subject to any prior lien on specific components, but that if the auction house had clear authority to sell, the buyer had clear title. He added that if what Weston was describing was what it sounded like, he should keep the roller door down and not answer questions from people he did not already trust. Weston said he understood, picked up his first wrench, and got to work. To understand what Weston Hale was holding, you had to go back more than a decade, to a time when the American automotive industry was caught between two futures it could not reconcile. On one side was the legacy, big displacement, high-torque engines that had defined American road identity for generations, machines that announced themselves before you saw them. On the other was the mandate, tightening emissions targets, rising fuel costs, and a global market organizing itself around efficiency and electrification. The industry's answer was to choose sides, and most manufacturers began the long conversion toward fully electric platforms, abandoning the mechanical vocabulary that had made American engines something more than transportation technology. But in a division of a mid-sized Michigan manufacturer, a small team of engineers had proposed a third path. Their argument was that the choice between performance and efficiency was a false one, that a properly engineered hybrid drivetrain could preserve the acoustic signature and torque character of a performance combustion engine while meeting the efficiency standards regulators were moving toward. The project was called Meridian, and its central component was a hybrid mechanical core designed from the ground up, integrating a high-output combustion block with an electromechanical coupling system, whose key innovation was that it did not compromise the primary engine's character to achieve its efficiency benefits. In early testing, the numbers made the engineers quietly excited in the way engineers rarely allow themselves before something is fully proven. Weston had been one of those engineers, working on combustion timing systems and the acoustic tuning of the block, the part of the work he found most absorbing because getting an engine to sound right was not something you could calculate from first principles. It required the kind of listening built through thousands of hours standing beside running machines, learning to distinguish a normal sound from one about to become a problem. He was good at this in a way difficult to explain to people who had not watched him do it, and the team relied on him for it, the way they relied on certain people for things that cannot be delegated to a procedure. The project ran just over 3 years before the parent company's financial position deteriorated to the point where the board began eliminating expenditures. Meridian was expensive, its commercial timeline was long, and several senior executives had privately concluded that the hybrid pathway was a delay rather than a destination. The decision to cancel came in a single meeting that lasted 45 minutes. The engineering team was given 60 days' notice. The prototype components were ordered into storage, and the design files were sealed. Weston had argued against the cancellation in writing, in person, and in the one conversation he managed with the division president, who had listened with professional courtesy and then thanked him for his contribution. 2 months later, Weston was processing his final paperwork at a desk that was no longer his. He had left the industry after that, not with drama but with the quiet exhaustion of a man who had put something real into something erased without ceremony. He opened the garage, took on repair work, and built a reputation through consistency rather than ambition. He had never expected to see any piece of the Meridian project again. The company had eventually filed for bankruptcy, its assets liquidated across multiple auctions, and somewhere in that process a pallet of prototype components had been mixed with general engine scrap, mislabeled, and stored in a warehouse until it appeared in the Cascade Automotive liquidation that brought Weston to that salvage yard on a cold Tuesday morning. When he spotted the H-47 stamp from across the lot, something moved in him that he had not felt in a long time, not excitement but recognition, the particular feeling of finding something you had not known you were still looking for. The month that followed was the hardest sustained work Weston had done since the Meridian team ran its final test sequence on a prototype that was then ordered destroyed. He established a rhythm that required everything he had. Garage open at 7. Paying work until 3, then the rest of the day and most of the evening devoted to the components on his bench. He slept in short pieces, woke early to check measurements left soaking in solvent overnight, ate standing over the sink, and wrote observations in a spiral notebook in handwriting that deteriorated as the weeks passed and fatigue accumulated. The garage at 2 in the morning had a quality Weston had come to know well during those weeks. The fluorescent light over the bench buzzed at a frequency you stopped hearing after the first hour, and then suddenly noticed again in extended silence. Rain hit the metal roof in patterns that changed with the wind, sometimes steady and sometimes in gusts that sounded like thrown gravel. The smell was oil and cold metal and chemical solvent, a combination his clothes absorbed so completely that he barely noticed it until he walked into a warm room and watched other people register it. On the bench, the Meridian components gradually revealed themselves as he cleaned and measured and documented, and what they revealed made the sleeplessness feel like a reasonable exchange. Several secondary components were missing entirely, including a pair of variable geometry valve bridges the original design used to manage combustion timing across the operating range. He machined replacement versions on the old 1972 Monarch lathe in the corner, working from measurements taken from the surviving components and from drawings he had made from memory, and the lathe gave him replacements within tolerance, if not identical to the originals. The larger problem was the control module, a proprietary electromechanical sequencer developed specifically for the project and never adapted for any other application. Without it, the hybrid coupling system could not be engaged. Weston spent 2 evenings tracing the acquisition history of the original supplier, found it had been absorbed into a larger parts manufacturer, and located a contact at the successor company. He wrote a careful letter and waited. It was during this waiting period that Tessa Holloway appeared at his door. He had not seen her since the Meridian project ended, though he had heard she had been dismissed from a subsequent position at Mercer Vale Motors after refusing to endorse a recommendation to permanently destroy the remaining Meridian documentation. She stood in his doorway holding a gas station coffee cup, looked at the components on his bench, and her expression moved through several stages before settling into something not quite disbelief but very close. She asked where he had found the H-47 block. He told her. She set her coffee down, walked to the bench, examined the casting markings in silence for 4 minutes, and when she looked up said the last known H-47 core had been listed as destroyed in the final project closure documentation. He said the documentation had apparently been wrong. She read through his spiral notebook without speaking, and when she finished told him that if he could get the control module, she believed it would run. The response from the Ohio Parts successor arrived 4 days later. They had found 2 prototype modules in untalogged storage. One was non-functional. The other had been stored in a sealed casing and tested responsive to voltage at the last inventory check, 11 years earlier. The company was willing to sell it as surplus legacy inventory for $240. Weston ordered it immediately and paid overnight shipping without calculating whether he could afford it. Cunt. Weston drove to the Mercer Vale Motors corporate office on a Wednesday morning and went inside to ask about a secondary timing calibration unit the Meridian documentation indicated had been stored with a test vehicle Mercer Vale had acquired through a subcontractor purchase years earlier. He gave his name to the receptionist and said he was there about a legacy component related to the H-47 program. Within 15 minutes, he was being escorted to a 4th-floor conference room with a long table and a view of the parking structure. Celeste Mercer came in alone. She was composed in the way of people who have trained themselves to show composure as a professional advantage, and she studied Weston briefly before speaking. She said the company did not typically release archive materials to private individuals, and that she would need to understand his interest before any decision. He told her he was restoring a Meridian Series drivetrain component. The composure held for another second, and then something shifted in her expression that she did not quite manage to conceal. Her father, the man who had founded Mercer Vale before stepping back, had spoken to her once about the Meridian project in the language specific to decisions made under financial pressure that looked different years later, telling her it was the one time in his career he had voted to stop something because a spreadsheet said to, and that he had spent a long time afterward uncertain whether the spreadsheet had been right. She had stored that memory without understanding its weight until this moment. Bryce Langston opened the conference room door without knocking and took a chair without being invited, already briefed, speaking immediately to say that archive materials were company property and that the company had no interest in helping private garage operations resurrect canceled technology. His voice was pleasant in the way of someone who has said unpleasant things so many times that the unpleasantness no longer registers in his own ears. Weston reached into his folder and laid his auction receipt on the table, the lot number, the price, and the auctioneer's authentication stamp, and said the core component was his legal property, and he was making a commercial inquiry about a specific archived part. Bryce's expression shifted in a way that suggested the receipt was an inconvenience he had not planned for. Celeste picked it up, read it, set it down, and told Weston she would have her archive team pull the component records and be in contact within 48 hours. It was not a yes, but it was something she had not given him when he walked in. Bryce Langston arrived at Weston's garage at 8:30 on a Thursday evening without calling ahead. He came in a black sedan with his assistant and a man carrying a briefcase who stood behind the others in the posture of someone whose job was to produce documents at the right moment. The roller door was halfway up, the bench lights casting a yellow rectangle across the damp driveway, and Weston was at the bench when he heard the car pull in. He finished the torque sequence on the fastener he was tightening, set his wrench down with deliberate care, and turned around. Bryce said the visit was informal, and he wanted a candid conversation before things became complicated, using the word complicated the way people use it when they mean something they prefer not to name. He said his investment group was prepared to make an offer substantially better than what Weston had paid at the auction. His assistant produced a document and slid it across a nearby surface, a purchase agreement for one consolidated lot of legacy automotive components for $5,000, containing a clause in compact legal language that transferred to the buyer all claims to any technology derived from or based upon the purchased materials. Weston read the document completely, set it face up on the bench, and said the price was generous for scrap, but not interesting for what was actually on his workbench. Bryce said he appreciated the negotiating posture and was open to a counter. Weston said his counter was that he was not selling. The smile stayed but became a different kind of smile, indicating a change in approach rather than disposition. Bryce described the practical realities of operating a commercial garage without full certifications, the attention that certain operations could attract from licensing boards and tax authorities, the way that small businesses sometimes found themselves navigating complications that larger operations handled more easily, delivering none of this as a specific threat, but as a description of environmental conditions. Holden Barrett stepped through the side door of the garage before anything further could be said. He introduced himself, handed Bryce a one-page letter stating that all future contact regarding the Cascade automotive components should be directed through his office, and Bryce read it without visible reaction. His assistant returned the purchase agreement to the briefcase. Before leaving, Bryce looked past Holden at the assembled components on the bench and at Tessa, working silently in the far corner since the sedan had arrived. Something changed in his expression as he registered what he was seeing. Components he had last seen dismissed as worthless now arranged with clear purpose and intention. Tessa did not look up. She said without addressing anyone specifically that the sequencer had arrived from Ohio that afternoon, and she thought they were ready for a cold start by the weekend. The sedan backed out without ceremony, and Weston listened to it go. They tried the first start on a Saturday night. Rain had been coming in since late afternoon, the cold, heavy kind that turned the concrete dark and filled the gutters with running water. And Tessa had spent most of Friday running diagnostics on the sequencer module. By 9 in the evening, both of them were as certain as they could be without actually turning the key, which is a different kind of certainty than the kind that comes from calculation alone. They had rigged a test harness from components Weston kept for diagnostic work, connecting it to the Meridian assembly in the way the original documentation described. The fuel supply was a sealed test canister positioned outside the main assembly, isolated with a shutoff either of them could reach in under 2 seconds. Weston engaged the sequencer, which responded with initialization tones Tessa said matched the startup sequence from the original test logs, and the assembly drew a mechanical breath as the intake circuits pressurized. Weston turned the key. The engine fired twice, hard and clean, and then went silent. A single warning channel on the test harness lit red. The overheat flag had triggered on the secondary cooling circuit, but the temperature log showed the reading spiked before the system came anywhere near actual operating temperature, which meant a sensor error rather than a real thermal event. Weston stood with his eyes closed, replaying the sound of the two firing events in his memory. Then he said the timing offset was not coming from the main timing chain, but from one of the auxiliary valve assemblies, a detail visible only to someone who had spent extended time with the actual prototype a decade ago. He spent the next 2 hours remachining the component on the Monarch lathe without hurrying, letting the machine and his hands find the adjustment through the combination of measurement and physical memory that skilled work stores in places the conscious mind cannot fully access. At 3:30 in the morning, they tried again. The engine did not start cleanly, but it ran for 7 continuous seconds before shutting down on a programmed sequencer timeout. And what came out in those 7 seconds was not the full voice of a running engine, but something preliminary and unmistakable, a low, sustained harmonic that moved through the floor and into the soles of their feet, contained but promising depth the way a sealed room can tell you how it will sound when it is finally open. Tessa looked at Weston over the test harness. Neither spoke. The rain continued on the roof. Weston nodded once and started making notes for the morning. The video had been shot through the gap in the partially raised garage door and captured less than 12 seconds of audio before the person filming stopped. What it captured was enough. The clip moved through collector networks and engineering communities with the velocity of something that touches an old nerve, because the people who recognized what they were hearing understood it immediately, and the people who did not recognize from the reaction of those who did that it was significant. By Wednesday of the following week, Weston had received 32 inquiries at the garage landline, 28 of which he let go to the answering machine. On the morning of the 30th day after the Cascade auction, Weston looked through the garage's small front window and saw them arriving. A collector he recognized from major automotive auctions across the Midwest, 2 SUVs from a venture capital firm, a car belonging to a parts procurement officer from one of the domestic automakers. Then Bryce Langston's black sedan, which parked at the curb rather than in the lot, positioned for a quick departure. Celeste Mercer arrived last, standing on the sidewalk for a moment before walking toward the garage, looking different from the CEO in the 4th-floor conference room, less certain of the room she was about to enter and more attentive to where she was going. Weston kept the roller door down until Holden arrived and they completed their checklist together at the back of the garage. Holden confirmed ownership documentation was complete, recording restriction notice was prepared, and a formal offer log was set up to receive any bids in writing. Tessa ran a final systems check and confirmed everything was within range. Outside, Bryce spoke to the assembled group loudly enough for Weston to hear through the door, suggesting the whole event was a sophisticated strategy to create artificial scarcity around restored vintage components, that the audio making the rounds had likely been distorted by poor recording equipment, and that anyone opening their wallet based on 12 seconds of audio deserved the disappointment that followed. 2 people laughed. The rest stayed where they were and said nothing. Holden stepped out to read the recording restriction notice. The crowd settled. Then Weston hit the mechanism and the roller door rose on its track with the familiar metal sound it made every morning, and the garage opened to the November air. What they saw was not polished. The Meridian assembly sat on a heavy-duty test stand in the center of the main bay, surrounded by diagnostic equipment and cabling, looking exactly like what it was, a rebuilt prototype component that had spent years in a scrapyard before someone took the time to understand it. The welds were visible, the replacement components clearly not factory original. But the assembly had the quality of something put together by someone who understood each piece individually, and the people standing in the driveway could see that before anything moved. Weston stood beside the assembly and said that 1 month ago, every person present had the opportunity to buy what they were looking at for $20, and nobody had taken it, and he was ready to show them what that decision had cost. He engaged the sequencer. The initialization tones moved through their sequence, the assembly drew its pressurized breath, and Weston turned the key with the stillness of someone who has rehearsed a moment many times in his mind and is now simply executing it. The Meridian core started. It came up through its startup cycle and found its operating condition in under 4 seconds, settling into a tone unlike anything in the current vocabulary of running engines. The combustion signature was deep and unambiguous, the kind of sound automotive engineers once described as character before the word was co-opted by marketing departments. A sound with texture and specificity, and a low-register presence that bypassed intellectual judgment and addressed something older in the listener, something that recognized this sound before the mind could form an opinion. At the same time, the hybrid mechanical coupling engaged, and instead of the irregular oscillation characteristic of a combustion engine under load, the assembly held its rhythm with an evenness that was almost architectural in precision, each cycle locking into the next with steadiness that should not have been possible in a rebuilt prototype running without full thermal management systems. The floor conducted it, not loudly, not with vibration that could be called uncomfortable, but with a persistent low presence felt in the feet and the chest, a presence that reorganized the crowd from a social arrangement into something more like an audience. Everyone facing the same direction, everyone quiet, everyone giving the sound full attention without having decided to. The paper cups on Holden's folding table skittered sideways from the surface vibration. A set of wrenches on the pegboard behind Tessa made a faint percussive sound. Outside, one of the SUV drivers lowered his window, and the sound moved across the driveway and into the November air and continued. Celeste Mercer stood 4 feet inside the garage door and did not move. She had attended product launches and engineering demonstrations throughout her professional life and had learned to manage her responses to them. She was not managing her response now. She was listening with the attention people give to things they understand cannot be easily replaced, and what she was hearing was her father's voice from years earlier, telling her about the best engine he had never heard run. And she understood that she was the first person in their family standing in the room when it finally did. Tessa monitored the instrument panel and let herself hear the sound for 10 full seconds before she read the numbers, as a deliberate separation of experiences, because she had been waiting for this since the day she had been handed her dismissal letter and told that her assessment of the Meridian project's potential was inconsistent with company direction. The torque curve was not merely meeting the original projections, but exceeding them in a way that should not have been possible, and the only explanation she could form was that Weston had machined the replacement components to a tolerance actually tighter than the originals. The outcome of a decade of accumulated skill working in a direction it did not know it was working. Bryce Langston stood near the back of the crowd with his arms crossed, and the sound was doing something to his composure he was trying to prevent and not entirely succeeding at. A collector raised his hand and said $2 million in the tone of someone testing a floor. A second voice said $5 million, with an indication the firm could structure a deal by end of week. One of the automaker representatives stepped back through the garage door with a phone pressed to his ear. Weston reached over and turned the key to off. The Meridian core wound through its shutdown sequence and went silent, and the silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the shape of what was no longer there. He waited for it to settle before he said he had heard the numbers, and was not interested in selling Meridian to anyone who wanted to put it in a vault, and that if anyone in the room wanted to talk about what the engine was for rather than what it was worth, he would be available after the crowd cleared. Celeste stayed. Most of the others filed out slowly, in the reluctant way of people who have not gotten what they wanted and have not yet decided what to do next. Bryce made a move toward the door and then reconsidered, standing near the roller door frame with his hands in his coat pockets. Holden stayed by the table. Tessa stayed at the panel. Celeste asked Weston quietly and directly how a prototype core from a canceled program had ended up in a scrap lot without anyone recognizing it. He told her the history plainly, from the project's beginning to its cancellation to the Tuesday morning at Cascade when he had recognized the H-47 stamp, giving her the information in the order it had happened. When he finished, she turned and asked Bryce a specific question. Whether he had been aware, at the time Mercer Vale made decisions about the Meridian documentation they had acquired through a subcontractor purchase, that the project's final test report had been modified before it reached the executive committee. Bryce said that was a significant allegation, and he would not respond without his own counsel present. His voice was steady, but the quality of his stillness had changed in a way legible to everyone in the room. Tessa opened her folder and placed two documents on the table side by side. The first was a photocopy of a Meridian test summary report dated approximately 3 months before the cancellation decision, its performance figures highlighted. The second was a copy of the version submitted to the board meeting where cancellation was approved. The performance figures in the second were substantially worse, and they had been substituted rather than annotated, meaning the originals had not been qualified downward but replaced entirely. Tessa said she had kept both copies because she had been asked to witness the submission of the second document, had refused, and had been dismissed within the month. Holden examined both documents and said that the disparity between them, combined with a documented connection between the financial advisors who had recommended cancellation and Bryce's investment group, was sufficient to support a civil investigation into whether the project had been deliberately misrepresented to the board. He said the preliminary filing would be submitted the following morning, regardless of what happened in the garage that night. The picture that assembled itself from the documents and from what Weston and Tessa each knew was not complicated once the pieces were in order. Bryce had positioned himself to acquire Meridian's intellectual property at a depressed valuation after cancellation, intending to sell it at a substantial multiple. The plan was disrupted when bankruptcy proceedings scattered the physical assets across multiple liquidation events, and the most critical component ended up in a mislabeled scrap lot rather than identifiable inventory. Bryce had attended the Cascade auction to find it, had not recognized it in the condition Weston purchased it, had laughed at the man who did, and had then spent a month trying to acquire it back for $5,000. Bryce Langston picked up his coat, walked out of the garage without speaking, and did not look back. Weston watched the taillights of the black sedan until they disappeared around the corner, feeling not triumph but the quieter satisfaction of understanding at last why something that had always seemed wrong had been exactly that. Celeste asked Tessa and Holden if she could speak with Weston alone. They stepped outside, pulling the side door shut behind them. The garage was lit by bench fluorescents and smelled of oil and the cold air that had come in when the roller door was open, and Celeste stood near the Meridian moment before speaking, looking at it with the expression of someone still adjusting to the full dimensions of something recently understood. She told Weston that Mercer Vale Motors was in a position she had not publicly described in accurate terms. The company's flagship electric platform had failed its third round of commercial testing Two major investors were in active discussions about withdrawing, and without a demonstrable technical differentiator before the spring industry review, the company would not survive the following fiscal year in its present form. She said this without self-pity and without making it his problem. She was giving him information, which was a form of respect she had not offered him on the day they first met. Then she named a number, $25 million for full transfer of rights to the recovered technology and its associated intellectual property. Weston was quiet. He picked up the small valve bridge he had remachined on the Monarch lathe and turned it in his hand the way he turned things when he was thinking. He said 25 million was more money than he had ever seen attached to his name in any context, and he understood what it would mean for a garage on the west side of Detroit, and he was refusing it. Celeste waited. She had enough experience with negotiations to understand a refusal was not always a permanent position. He said that what she was offering was the end of Meridian, that she would buy it, absorb it into a corporate structure, and within 2 years the engineers who had built the original would be a footnote in a press release. He said that what she owed was not a payment, but a restoration, that if she wanted Meridian to work for Mercer Vale, she needed to rebuild the project with the people who had understood it, that the team leads from the original program were mostly still working in the industry and mostly still carrying the specific anger of people who had been right and not been believed, and that they deserved to be in the room when their work finally ran at full capacity. He said the production facility needed to be in Detroit, not a symbolic address, but an actual manufacturing presence employing the kind of workers who had built this industry before investment logic decided they were a cost to minimize. Celeste held his gaze through all of this without looking away or making the small movements of someone waiting for a conversation to end. When he finished, she said she would need to think about the structure, but was not going to pretend the conditions were unreasonable. She asked what she would get for agreeing to them. He said she would get the only engine in production that sounded like something worth building a company around. They worked out a framework over the following hour, with Holden called back to document the terms in real time. Weston retained ownership of the recovered core and the intellectual property developed during the restoration. Mercer Vale would fund a dedicated engineering facility. Tessa would lead the technical team. Original project contributors would be formally credited in all documentation, and revenue from commercial applications would be shared under terms Holden described as unusual in their balance, but not without precedent. When Celeste left, she shook Weston's hand at the roller door and looked at the Meridian assembly one last time in the way people look at things they are still learning the full dimensions of. In the months that followed, the building that had been Hale Mechanical became something unrecognizable to the people who had driven past it without looking. The Mercer Vale engineering presence moved in around it, incrementally. A leased facility 3 blocks away for primary testing, a converted warehouse down the street for fabrication, and at the center of all of it, still under Weston's name, the garage itself, where the Monarch lathe still ran, and the original Meridian assembly still occupied the test stand. Weston had refused the offer to relocate it, saying it had run for the first time in this room and would continue to run here until it was ready to run somewhere else. The original Meridian engineers came back in 1s and 2s over the first 2 months, reached with a message explaining what had happened and what was being built. Most said yes before the conversation was over. One, a woman who had moved to Germany after the cancellation, flew back for the initial team meeting and spent the first hour looking at the restored assembly in silence, and then spent the second hour stating precisely what needed to be done next with the focused authority of someone who had been waiting 10 years for the question to be asked again. The younger engineers who joined to supplement the original team had grown up in the industry knowing Meridian only as a rumor, a canceled program, referenced in certain circles as an example of the distance between what was technically possible and what was commercially permitted, and finding themselves working on it under the direction of the people who had designed it produced in them a quality of engagement that went beyond professional commitment into something closer to conviction, the particular efficiency of people who believe in what they are doing and therefore do not require maintenance. Bryce Langston was removed from the Mercer Vale Investor Board at the quarterly meeting that followed Holden's civil filing. The resolution moved by Celeste herself and passed with a margin indicating no one had been surprised. The collectors and investors who had made verbal offers in the garage and had not been accepted now needed to request appointments through Holden's office for any future licensing discussions, a transition in standing that some of them managed with more grace than might have been expected. Celeste made a statement at the Spring Industry Review in which she acknowledged, without prompting and without softening the admission, that Mercer Vale had made decisions that undervalued the contribution of working engineers and had prioritized financial optics over technical merit. She said the company was engaged in correcting that record. Several industry journalists wrote about the statement as unusual in its specificity. Celeste said privately that it was simply accurate. Weston continued to open the garage at 7 each morning. He continued to make his own coffee and handle ordinary repair work alongside the Meridian project, because he said that working on common problems kept your hands honest, and honest hands made fewer mistakes on the uncommon ones. He drove himself to the official Meridian demonstration at the Mercer Vale testing facility in the same white pickup with the bad tailgate, sat in the second row during the presentation rather than the front, and when a journalist found him afterward and asked how it felt to transform $20 of salvage into a technology the entire sector was now watching, he looked toward the testing bay, where the Meridian assembly sat in its new housing, clean and purposeful and loud in the way of things that have found their proper use, and he said that it had never been scrap. He said the people who called it that were the same people who had forgotten how to listen to what a machine was actually telling them. And in that room, on that morning, with the sound of the Meridian core moving through the floor and into the feet of every person standing there, the men and women who had laughed at a $20 bill in a cold salvage yard understood at last what they had been too loud and too certain of themselves to hear.